Welcome back for our afternoon sessions of the Louis Sullivan Architectural Ornaments at SIUE conference. We are delighted this afternoon to begin with our first speaker being John Celuch. John is the design director of Inland Design, a graphic design firm here in Edwardsville. He earned his MFA degree from SIUE and served as the curator of the University of Sullivan Ornament Collection from 1969 to 1976. He's cataloged, restored, reproduced, and displayed these ornaments that were purchased from Richard Nickel. And in 2007, 8, 9, he supervised the renovation of this exhibit, working with Paul Sprague, art historian, and writing the text for these interpretive exhibit panels. Please welcome John Celuch.
You're going to get another taste of Richard Nickel. I love to talk about him, but Ward is going to talk about him, and I'm going to talk about him, and film. You've seen the WTTW film. Mark Smith said to me last night. He may have said it to you. I can't remember if it was just the audience he said it to, or said to me afterwards, that Nickel's story has the makings for a motion picture, and I think there's something to that. So I'm going to start encouraging Mark to follow up on his idea. I first want to thank Therese Dickman for inviting me to talk today about my favorite subject, Louis Sullivan. I also wanted to thank Grant Andre for bringing Mark Smith and his beautiful film to the SIUE campus. I've seen it about a dozen times, and I'm just overwhelmed by it each time I see it. I also want to welcome Ward Miller, who I haven't seen in a while. It's good to see you, Ward, and know that you're still fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Of course, Ward, prior to his time with the Nickel Committee, prior to his current job, was the executive director of the Nickel Committee, which was the repository for the Nickel Archive. He was helpful for me to do the interpretation of the material you see behind you. I've titled my presentation LHS at SIU. I didn't put the E on the end, since we didn't call it the E back in the 60s. Jack Randall was a unique individual with a great love for architecture. He called himself a pamphleteer, which was a term given the early American patriots who campaigned for freedom. He wrote and published dozens of works himself, including Treasures of American Architecture and Skyscrapers the First 100 Years. As a young man, Jack was a close friend of architectural photographer Richard Nickel. He fought side by side with Nickel, and in the effort to save many of Louis Sullivan's highly significant buildings, mostly from Chicago. Jack succeeded in saving Sullivan's Wainwright building in St. Louis and the Guarantee building in Buffalo, New York. While serving as the university architect for Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, Jack was instrumental in establishing a permanent home for Nickel's growing collection of ornament, rescued from Sullivan buildings in Chicago. Nickel was born on Chicago's west side in 1928. His father drove a newspaper delivery truck, I believe it was the Tribune, and his mother worked in an assembly plant. After high school graduation, he enlisted in the Army in 1946, spending 2 years as a paratrooper and a military police officer in occupied Japan. He returned to Chicago to take advantage of the GI Bill and enrolled in photography classes at the Institute of Design of the Illinois Institute of Technology, a decision that would shape his life. It was here that Nickel met his two photography mentors, Aaron Siskind and Harry Callahan, two men who would become the world's foremost modern photographers. In 1950, Nickel was called back to active duty in Korea, this time as a photographer, where he spent a year and then returned to his IIT classes. He was introduced to the architecture of Adler and Sullivan through a class assignment by Siskind, who explained, "Show voluminous details, structural details, and decorative details." Nickel wrote in 1959, "I had no feel about architecture, knew nothing about Sullivan. In short, was completely stupid." Nickel and his classmates stayed with the assignment. That's him in the lower right. In 1954, Nickel organized a class photo exhibit which displayed 75 buildings of the known original 114. He continued his building research and was soon consumed as an architectural detective, discovering numerous unknown Adler and Sullivan structures. He wrote a master's thesis and planned a book on the subject. He had little formal architectural training, but he was completely understanding of architecture and genius in the quality of the work he was dealing with. In all, Nickel found 38 forgotten Sullivan commissions. At the same time, the city of Chicago was undergoing a massive urban renewal project. One by one, a great majority of these buildings and many significant others were to meet their doom with the wrecking ball. Mayor Richard Daley promised he would wipe out the slums in 20 years, and few objected to his goal. As Adler and Sullivan buildings began to come down, Nickel began collecting ornament. He realized that if he didn't save the ornament, no one else would, and that all traces of these buildings would be lost forever. His major public effort to save Sullivan's Garrick Theater in Chicago's Loop began as a letter-writing campaign in the Chicago dailies. It rallied the support of thousands. What Nickel didn't realize was that he had become one of the first preservationists in the country. I think this morning the presentation, one of the presentations talked about, someone said that we're accustomed to protest these days. Witness the soon 100 days of the Trump administration. But they didn't rally around buildings back then. It was a handful, and it started, and they started to be successful doing it. Nickel hauled away doors, chimney tops, wrought iron window grills, new posts, fragments of terracotta, and columns, anything he could lift. And I said to someone at lunch today that I'm amazed that he was a fairly slight guy. He wasn't a muscular guy, and this stuff is heavy. So he was a bit of a genius in how to rig it and get it down on the ground. Of course, with taller buildings, sometimes he could talk to the workmen and convince them or pay them to help him out. But it was somewhat miraculous what he was able to save. He solicited help from friends John Vinci, David Norris, and Tim Samuelson. He continued his Herculean effort and stored his treasures at the home he shared with his parents, and you remember what the neighbors thought of that. As the collection began to grow, he needed more space, which he found in a warehouse at Navy Pier, a temporary location at best. Moving the collection several times was stressing the artifacts, and as a result, stressing Nickel. He wanted to find a home in Chicago. He approached likely candidates, including the Chicago Historical Society, the Museum of Science and Industry, and the McCormick Charitable Foundation, even the Art Institute of Chicago. No one was interested. No one until Jack Randall stepped forward. Jack Randall moved from Chicago to Edwardsville in 1961. He worked with his father was an architect. His father's name was Frank, and he worked for a time with his dad. But he'd been hired as the associate university architect. There was a lead architect at the Carbondale campus who had to give his blessing as well to anything that would be done. But Jack served as the associate, and he acted on behalf of the university during construction of the new campus. Nickel and Randall campaigned together in Chicago to save Adler and Sullivan's Garrick Theater. Randall was keenly aware of Nickel's collection of ornament. He was also aware that a university environment was Nickel's last choice for a permanent home. I mentioned last night at the film that Dick was he was concerned that a university wouldn't have the type of cast of expertise that a museum would. So I guess from that argument perspective, he was probably right. I recall reading some later correspondence between Dick and the collection, and I think he got convinced that the university students weren't like children that were going to go around spray painting this ornament. But I think that was his concern. Yeah, at one point he was concerned about lipstick. Randall was enthusiastic and impassioned, and eventually won Nickel over. However, more importantly, he convinced President Dwight Morris to purchase the collection, even though the university's art consultant, Saturday Review art critic Catherine Koo, lobbied against the purchase. This was a time when there was a percentage of budget, I believe it was a half of a percent, that went to purchase artwork in public buildings, and that included college campuses like this one. So there was an opportunity there to buy a lot of art, and the art that you see on campus, which we have a museum that's made up of buildings. The Rodin you see in the light well here was part of that original purchase, and there is art around the campus, and that's how it got there. They were able to make a significant purchase, which has certainly benefited the campus in all these years. The final agreement for the collection price tag was $12,000. It was made on October 18th, 1965. This next the picture was mentioned in the talk this morning. The value of the stock exchange grills, which you see two of them in the corner over here. There was I'm sure you're familiar with the Antiques Roadshow. They had this piece on the roadshow over a year ago, and the value was $30,000 to $40,000. And it was mentioned this morning that it was a $500,000 price tag to put a complete wall together of the entire the grills and the elevator shaft at the Seattle Art Museum. Just kind of amazing. Upon arrival of the material to the SIUE campus, Randall had a plan to display the material inside and outside Lovejoy Library. He had befriended the library director, John Abbott, who was very much in favor of Randall's plan, and the installation began. HOK, the architects of the campus, strengthened these walls beyond what they needed to be in order to hang these extremely large pieces. There was a local craftsman, his name was Tanner Compton, I think long since deceased, who created all of the brackets and things that support this material. So on May 13th, 1966, the Louis Sullivan Architectural Ornament Collection was ready for viewing. Now, in case you're wondering where I fit into this story, I'll oblige your curiosity. Earlier that same day of that opening, on the 16th of May, 7 of my fellow SIU Carbondale design students and our mentor traveled to Edwardsville to attend the collection's opening. We had a first-hand opportunity to see 2 Adler and Sullivan St. Louis masterpieces, the 1890 Wainwright Building on the left and the Union Trust Building, 1892. The Wainwright Building is a 7th and Olive, and the Union Trust is now called 705 Olive, and it's a block away. And interesting thing I can tell you is the Union Trust Building has been purchased by a hotelier, and they're going to put $55 million into it and convert it into a boutique hotel. So that's good news. I'm hoping that they'll restore the street level, because there's a lot of ornament that I don't remember that I've got some of the ornament in this presentation, but that's I can't think of the name of the firm that's doing it, but there is a company in St. Louis, developer that specializes in historic preservation, and so there's somebody on board here that knows what they're doing. No, it's not the Lawrence Group. It's a husband and wife team. Really? Small company, and they've got a track record. They've got a lot. Joe?
Gill. The last name is Gill.
Yeah, that's right. So I stayed in touch with Randall through my senior year and stopped to see him on occasion when I visited with my family relatives in the area. Upon my graduation from SIU, Randall informed me that he was trying to get a curator position established at the university, and that if I wanted it, the job was mine. 7 months later, I was working in the architectural office of Harris Armstrong in Kirkwood, Missouri, and there was a call from Jack telling me that the job had materialized. Sort of. John Abbott told Jack there was an opening for a medical illustrator in the audiovisual department. Just a ticket to get me on the university staff. It was a full-time job that paid $200 more a month, but more importantly, it got me close to the collection, just 2 floors above me. My office was right below where I'm standing. Only 2 months had gone by when I came home one day to find a greetings letter from Uncle Sam. This, of course, was the Vietnam era, the tail end. I'd been wrongfully drafted 3 times while an undergraduate. I decided that I couldn't push my luck any further, and I decided to make the best of it and enlisted in order to go to the Army Engineer Officer Candidate School of Fort Belvoir, Virginia. So after only 3 months, my last official act was to create an outdoor Sullivan display for the opening night of the Mississippi River Festival. Yeah, I left at a bad time. The opening night of the Mississippi River Festival, and I was gone for 2 years and 7 months, and I missed a lot of great shows. But it was a big show where I was too.
What was the date, opening night?
It was early June, 1969. I can't remember the exact date. So 2 years and 7 months later, I returned to campus. Jack Randall was gone. His position eliminated due to budget cuts. How often we hear those words around here. Art Department architectural historian Harry Hilberry was now responsible for the collection as well as his teaching load. He and I had been working together for about a year when Harry mysteriously contracted encephalitis. His subsequent retirement put the collection into my hands. I had put together an MFA program utilizing the collection as my resource. I would determine an accession system, photograph each piece of ornament, create an accession catalog, explore reproduction materials and techniques that result in lightweight, accurate reproductions that can be created and transported at low cost. The university was receptive to unique proposals, and mine would be the first of its kind. Some MFA candidates chose projects focused on a particular Sullivan ornament restoration or reproduction. For example, the reassembly of a 13th floor stock exchange column was completed and displayed in the elevator lobby on this floor. When you came up, it was right there opposite. It was restored by a painter, an MFA painter named Ferd Lang, and there was a cast of graduate students that they were required to take a Sullivan project as part of their program. So they get, I think, a minimum of 3 hours credit, and then I would oversee what they were doing. As if I had all the answers. Cleaning this column, you can see in the nickel photograph, where's my pointer? The columns are up here, and the building was this buff terracotta color. So the years of Chicago coal being burned caused the buildings to turn jet black, and you'll also see in that landing area there's a piece of Garrick Theater right there that's never been cleaned. That's buff terracotta. Shown here is a wall stencil reproduction from the Chicago Auditorium building. It hangs in the stair tower between the second and third floors. I had a graduate assistant who helped with ornament rescue and restoration. We traveled to Chicago occasionally to pick up ornament salvaged by nickel. I personally worked with new materials and techniques creating reproductions of Sullivan ornament. I had kind of a unique situation. I was a graduate student that had a graduate student assistant, and I was a staff member too. And like Dick earlier, I mentioned I had the GI Bill, and it was just a great opportunity. I'd been taken away from the collection for a period of time, and then the government was handing me a check for $300 every month to go to school. It was good times. Between 1965 and 1972. Richard Nickel continued to be on the lookout for building demolitions, and the university made subsequent purchases for building ornament from several Sullivan buildings. Of particular significance is the house that Sullivan designed for his mother in 1892. She died just months before its completion, so Sullivan moved in. Several years later, his brother Albert, who paid for the house, moved his family in. Louis was particularly fond of the carved limestone tympanum over the front door and had the design created again in plaster over the fountains in the transportation building at the World's Fair in Chicago. There's the tympanum right there. It's a reproduction. Made of plaster, just like it was originally. Nickel considered purchasing the house for a mere $2,000 in 1972, but decided against it because it was considered a bad neighborhood. Later, Nickel wrote to Harry Hilberry, "There is one piece of limestone ornament on the building, the arched front door lintel." He's got his terminology wrong. It's not a lintel, it's a tympanum. That I think is very valuable. So much so that I think it would be valuable to buy the building for this single piece and pay for demolition, etc. Ironically, the neighborhood has come back, earning status as a National Historic District. It is tragic that an empty lot occupies space between two historic homes, while the facade of the Sullivan House lies here in storage. I think you saw a picture in Mark's presentation that showed the horizontal shelves. But the real tragedy is the fate of Richard Nickel. In 1972, Adler and Sullivan's Chicago Stock Exchange building, the designated landmark, was in jeopardy. A lengthy battle ensued, and in the end, the battle for the building was lost. But not all was lost. The famous trading room was salvaged piece by piece by Nickel, architect friend John Vinci, David Norris, and Tim Samuelson. I think we heard in Vinci's words this morning the comment that Dick made to him, being afraid that they could never complete the project. Unfortunately, they proved him wrong. Vinci was in the lead here because he would direct the project to reinstall the entire space in addition to the Art Institute of Chicago. A single donor paid the $2 million restoration and installation cost. That's the kind of donor we need here.
Did these pieces weigh tons? How do they move it?
It's all plaster, so it's fairly lightweight. Besides, for only the second time in his life, Richard had a love interest. That is, a love interest other than Louis Sullivan. His upcoming marriage to Carol Sutter had at last moved his passion in another direction. Nickel had committed to salvaging ornament for the collection, and he spent time negotiating with the wrecking company on behalf of SIUE. He had a good relationship with the wrecker, who allowed him to take whatever he wanted if he provided the labor. On April 13th, Richard went to the Stock Exchange building. Although he had promised Carol that his salvaging days would soon be over, he had made a to-do list and returned to the site to pick up ornament in the trading room. I confess that the Richard Cahan book, the new one, Dangerous Years, has a note, and it's a note he wrote to himself. He kept lists, and at the top of the list of what to pick up at the Stock Exchange building was SIU column. So it's been painful my whole life, knowing that he was there for us. Upon being seen on the site, he was quickly ushered off the property. Several collapses had occurred that day, and the wrecker was not about to let him in. Later, however, Nickel returned, and he was either in the trading room or the restaurant a floor below when the floor of the trading room collapsed. It was a massive collapse, and his body was found in the rubble 28 days later. Giving one's life for a cause is a supreme sacrifice, but the thrill of the hunt and the possibility of saving a small fragment of Louis Sullivan's art can overpower one's sensibilities. I know that thrill. Once you find something of significance, it's difficult to stop looking. The year after Richard's death, I found myself in the bowels of Sullivan St. Nicholas Hotel in St. Louis. We had 2 weeks to remove whatever we could find. There wasn't a day went by over the 2 weeks we worked that I didn't think about Richard's fate. I could hear and feel the dull thud of the wrecking ball through the building. I couldn't wait to be finished. But I could never be finished. There was always more ornament to save. That must have been the same thought Richard had with each building demolition. The further you go, the more original treasures you'll find. But at what cost? I needed more time, but time was up, and it was time to leave. In 1976, I finished my thesis on the St. Nicholas Hotel and earned my MFA in art history. To my knowledge, it's still the only MFA in art history ever awarded by SIUE. I left the university the same year to start my own design firm, which turned 40 last July. On the occasion of SIU Edwardsville's 50th anniversary, Provost Paul Ferguson accepted my proposal to interpret the Sullivan material in this space, which is known as the Sullivan Lounge. Originally, this space had some very nice furniture in it, long couches and side chairs manufactured by a real high-end furniture design company called Stendig. No, they've been absorbed by somebody, and I would come up here and I would find students asleep. It's interesting how our technology has changed. When the personal computer came along and the laptop, students started buying up laptops and taking them to class. And our power supply here was inadequate. There weren't enough outlets to plug computers into. So there would be extension cords, and it was just crazy. And I remember I got kind of offended by it. I wanted to see this not as a lounge per se, but as an exhibit. So I received a guarantee of assistance to do this project from the Richard Nickel Committee Ward, the Art Institute of Chicago, and Sullivan historian Dr. Paul Sprague. This effort provided an opportunity to showcase the collection not only to students, faculty, and staff, but visitors to the university as well. I have often said that SIU Edwardsville should be famous for owning this collection. Most of the items displayed and archived here are one of a kind. The project included providing photographs of the buildings so that the material can be presented in context, not just as pieces of decorative art hung on a wall. The great majority of the photographs are made by Richard Nickel, taken before buildings were demolished and never before published. Paul Sprague, who is well known for his scholarly research and writing on the work of Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Walter Burley Griffin, wrote text for the 30 buildings represented in this exhibit, which date between 1881 and 1919. He evaluates the changes in Sullivan's designs from the early influence of working in the office of architect Frank Furness in Philadelphia to his mature work for the National Farmers Bank at Owatonna, Minnesota. The text also delivers insights to the success of Adler and Sullivan as directed by Sullivan's very capable business partner, engineer Dankmar Adler. The 40-foot legacy wall entrance into the Sullivan Lounge features 9 panels which tell the stories of Sullivan and Nickel. Sullivan stands on the front steps of his Ocean Springs, Mississippi retreat. Nickel stands atop one of his favorite buildings, the Republic Building in 1961. Destined for demolition that year, Nickel remarked, "I'm getting a headache thinking about it." Sullivan's cottage was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I'm happy to have had the opportunity to make this presentation. If you want to learn more, about Richard Nicol. Richard Cahan's third book on the subject is a masterpiece. Titled Richard Nicol, Dangerous Years, the book presents Nicol's letters, notes, and his photographs arranged in chronological order, handwritten and typewritten. The presentation of his correspondence made me feel like I was eavesdropping into Nicol's private world. The dust jacket says it all. This breathtaking book is the closest you will ever come to knowing Richard Nicol. I also must recommend, and it truly is the book which Richard Nicol started, but needed to be completed decades later by others, most notably John Vinci and Ward Miller. The title says complete, and it is indeed complete. And nearly everything you see on display here can be found in the book. There's a copy of the book here. Oh. You need a crane to lift this thing.
8.5 pounds.
It's like the Bible.
Yeah, this is the Bible of Louis Sullivan. This is marvelous. Richard would be very happy with this end product. It's just too bad he couldn't have been the one to finish it.